It began with a sound, not thunder, not wind, but a soft bark echoing through an empty house by the lake. When Ethan returned to pack his grandmother's things, he thought it would just be another goodbye. But behind a sealed wall, he found a hidden room, and a letter that would change everything he thought he knew about his family. What secret could one woman guard for 70 years? And what truth was she trying to protect, her past or his future? What Ethan uncovered next will test your heart and remind you that some love stories never end. They just wait to be found. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, faith, and second chances. By the time Ethan Cole reached the edge of Willow Creek, the afternoon rain had thinned into mist, leaving the road slick and silver beneath the pines. The lake below was still and pale, a mirror of cloud and memory. The small wooden house stood where it always had, half hidden by moss and the hush of rain, its windows dim and knowing, as if they had seen too much. It wasn't large, but it carried the weight of generations, and to Ethan, it felt heavier than any place he had ever returned to. He stepped out of the truck slowly, boots pressing into the gravel with a sound that broke the quiet. The duffel strap bit into his shoulder, familiar and unwelcome. He paused on the porch and drew a breath, expecting only the scent of damp wood. But what came instead was peppermint and cedar, the faint perfume of a woman who refused to fade. His grandmother, Margaret Cole, had been gone 3 weeks. Yet in that moment, it felt as though she were still inside, waiting by the fire with her book and her quiet smile. Buddy padded beside him, the German shepherd's coat darkened by the mist. 8 years old, with ears that never missed a sound, Buddy carried himself like an old soldier, disciplined, alert, yet softened by loyalty. His fur was streaked with silver along the muzzle, his steps steady but measured. Once trained for rescue, he had learned something gentler in the years since: how to keep a man from falling apart without saying a word. And in Ethan's case, that was no small task. Inside, the air was thick with silence and memory. The floorboards creaked beneath Ethan's boots, releasing faint traces of mint and dust. The house had always smelled like that, cool and calm, like his grandmother's hands when she touched his forehead during sleepless nights. He stood in the hallway, where framed photographs lined the walls like a family of ghosts. There was one of his grandfather, proud in uniform, and another of Margaret as a young woman, soft-eyed, her smile caught halfway between shyness and secret. Ethan reached to straighten it, then stopped, afraid to disturb the peace that lingered. He moved to the living room. The clock above the fireplace ticked unevenly, the rhythm off by a breath. That clock had soothed him as a boy through storms and fevers, but now it sounded like a pulse trying to remember its purpose. He sat down heavily, staring into the space where the fire used to glow, his reflection trembling in the soot-dark glass. PTSD wasn't something Ethan liked to name out loud. He preferred to call it noise, the static that filled his head when the world got too quiet. Some nights it came as a tremor before sleep, other nights as flashes of heat and light behind his eyes. Margaret had known how to quiet it. She'd brew tea, hum an old hymn, and say, "You can't fight memories, Ethan. You have to listen to them until they speak." But listening was hard when silence sounded like thunder. He rose and moved toward the kitchen. Everything was as she'd left it. The kettle by the stove, the jars lined neatly on the shelf, each labeled in her careful handwriting: sugar, flour, dried mint. Even the old calendar still hung on April, the month she'd passed. He opened the back door and let in the lake air. It smelled like pine and rusted metal, like time itself. Buddy sniffed the threshold, tail flicking once, then followed Ethan toward the small reading room at the end of the hall. That room had always been Margaret's heart. Shelves bowed beneath the weight of books, some classics, some cookbooks, some so old their spines had turned the color of dust. Ethan smiled faintly as he ran a hand along them. His grandmother used to say stories were just prayers that learned to walk. He began to pack them carefully, wrapping each one in old newspaper. The sound of folding paper was the only noise in the room. Then Buddy froze. The shepherd's ears lifted, nose twitching toward the corner bookshelf. He gave a low growl, not out of fear, but confusion. Ethan turned. "What is it, boy?" Buddy pawed once at the base of the shelf, then stepped back, head tilted. Ethan crouched, his hand brushing against the floorboard. That's when he saw it, a seam running unevenly along the wall behind the bookshelf, the wood faintly lighter in color, as though painted over long ago. He leaned in closer, tracing the faint ridge with his fingers. The paint cracked under his touch, flaking like old bark. Beneath it, he felt solid wood, but hollow when tapped. There was space behind it. His heartbeat quickened. "That's strange," he murmured. Margaret wasn't the type to hide anything. She had lived her life like open sunlight, simple, honest, full of quiet grace. And yet, she had always avoided talking about her younger years, the war, or the man in the uniform on the wall. He braced both hands against the shelf. "Come on, old girl," he muttered. "Let's see what you're hiding." The shelf resisted, heavy with decades of stillness. He pushed harder. The wood groaned, a deep, tired sound, then shifted an inch. Dust fell in soft gray clouds. Buddy barked once, startled, the sound bouncing off the low ceiling. Ethan coughed, waving the dust away, and stepped back. There, beneath a layer of faded paint, he saw it clearly now. A rectangle of wall, the outline of something sealed. The edges were too straight to be random. He ran his hand over it again, searching for a latch, a crack, anything. But there was only wood and the stubborn stillness of secrets meant to stay buried. Buddy pressed close to his leg, eyes fixed on the wall. Ethan felt the dog's warmth through his jeans and steadied himself. "Easy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. He studied the wall for a long moment. The clock ticked faintly from the next room, filling the air with a rhythm too fragile to break. He thought of his grandmother's voice again. Soft, patient, unafraid. Not everything hidden is meant to stay buried. Was it memory or something else? The mist outside thickened, dimming the last of the afternoon light. The lake beyond the window blurred into silver shadow. Ethan lowered himself to the floor beside Buddy, both of them staring at that sealed patch of wall as if it might breathe. The air smelled of dust, varnish, and rain-soaked wood. Maybe grief was like this, he thought. Maybe it wasn't about letting go, but learning what still holds you. Maybe some walls weren't built to protect the living, but to shelter what the dead couldn't finish saying. He rested his hand lightly on Buddy's back. The shepherd lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes catching the fading light. And then, as if answering a question only he could hear, Buddy barked. Once, soft, deliberate. Ethan's gaze followed the sound toward the wall. His fingers tightened on the flashlight at his side. Something in this house was waiting to be remembered. The first nail came free with a shriek that seemed too loud for the small study, and dust rose in a soft gray plume that stung Ethan's eyes. He worked the blade of a flathead under the second nail, then the third, shoulders tight, breath measured the way he'd been taught when patience mattered more than force. The board had been painted over long ago, the color a half shade off from the rest of the wall. Close up, he could see brush hairs fossilized in the finish, a hasty job meant to be seen but not examined. Buddy stood to his left with his nose at the seam, ears forward, tail still, the posture of a dog translating silence. When the last nail clinked onto the floor, Ethan pressed his palm to the panel. It gave a fraction. He set his shoulder and pushed, once, twice, the wood resisting not like a door, but like a memory that didn't want to witness. The panel sighed and tipped inward. Cold air exhaled from the cavity, dry and papery, laced with cedar and the faint tang of iron. A narrow inner door waited behind the boards. No knob, only a rust-brown keyhole and the ghost of a handle plate that must have been removed decades ago. Ethan slid the flathead into the seam and levered. The latch surrendered with a brittle crack. He lifted his flashlight, thumbed it on, and swept a cone of light into the dark. A tight rectangular room opened, 8 feet across, maybe 10 deep. A cell of time walled off from weather and grief. Spiderwebs netted the corners like lace. A single bulb hung from a cloth-wrapped wire. Grime filmed its glass like old frost. He reached up and tugged the chain. Click. The bulb jittered to life, humming a thin electric note as a weak yellow halo spread and held, pooling over a wooden desk, a metal cot with a folded blanket, and a stack of crates stenciled with faded letters. The light made the air itself visible, dust motes floating like slow snow. Buddy stepped in first, paws careful, nose working. Ethan followed, one hand low, palm open, an old habit from rooms that might hold awful surprises. This room held softer ones. The far wall had newspaper clippings tacked in uneven rows, headlines about ration books, a photo of a factory shift waving flags, a column on war bonds. Next to them, a corkboard with 3 black and white photographs. The first, a young Margaret near the porch of this very house, hair pinned back, chin lifted, a smile trying not to be brash. The second, men in uniform beside a makeshift bridge over a muddy creek. The third made Ethan forget to breathe, Margaret again, shoulder to shoulder, with a tall officer whose jaw looked cut from stone and whose eyes, even flat in grayscale, seemed lit from inside. The caption beneath, in tidy fountain pen ink, Captain Carl Reinhardt, Willow Creek, 1944. Ethan took the frame down with both hands. Margaret's expression wasn't the one from the hallway portraits. There, she was gentle and composed. Here, there was a spark, a private light that belonged only to the moment the shutter had caught. The officer's cap sat square on fair hair. His mouth was almost smiling, not quite. Ethan felt a draft move across his neck and realized it was only the breath he'd been holding. On the desk, a tin box sat under a soft skin of dust. Buddy nudged it once, then looked up as if asking permission. "Go on," Ethan murmured and brushed the lid clean. The box creaked open. Inside lay a length of sun-faded ribbon, a handful of ration tokens, and a silver medal nested in tissue gone the color of tea. He lifted it by the ribbon. The metal was cool against his fingers. Its inscription had softened, but remained legible. To save one life is to save the world entire. The phrase rang in him like a struck note. He turned the medal over, half expecting a name. There was none, only a shallow nick at the edge where it must have been dropped and caught. He set the medal down and slid open the top desk drawer. Yellowed letters lay bundled by a fraying blue ribbon. Some were stamped from faraway cities, London, Paris, Antwerp. Others were unstamped, addressed in a careful hand, as if mail had been less possible than hope. He loosened the ribbon and chose a thin envelope. Its ink bled slightly at one corner. "My dearest M," the first line read, "They will not let us cross the river at night now, so we wait much of each day to do our work. We have become men of bridges, some of wood, some of rope, and some only of words said gently enough to make frightened people put down their bags and believe us." The rest of the page described repairs, a child guided over a makeshift span, a sudden rainfall that sent men laughing under tarps, small human stitches put through torn cloth. Ethan folded it back into its envelope with a care that felt like apology. A draft tapped the bulb. It wavered and steadied with a soft hum. Buddy shifted and pressed his shoulder gently into Ethan's side, as if he had heard something else. The change in his handler's breathing, the quickened metronome in his chest. Ethan kept his hand on the dog's ruff a moment, feeling the warm life there. He tried the next drawer. It stuck. He rocked it left, then right, and it released with a wooden groan. An old pocket Bible lay on top, cracked leather warm from the bulb's feeble heat. Beneath, a palm-sized notebook. Beneath that, a sealed envelope the color of straw, its wax impressed with a small emblem of crossed wings above a flame. Across the face, in a tremoring hand that Ethan knew as well as his own name, "To my son, if this ever reaches you." He didn't move. The envelope seemed to brighten along the edges where the bulb's light gathered. The letters faced him like a door. He reached, then paused, his fingertips hovering as if sensation alone might read what ink had written. He turned it over once. The back was unmarked. He imagined the hand that had sealed it, the same hand that used to label peppermint jars, that had steadied his face when he returned from a bad night, that had mended shirts to outlast the years. Ethan set the envelope on the blotter and opened the little notebook instead. Pencil had pressed deep into the paper in a few short entries, dates and a sketch of a bridge truss, a list of names with asterisks next to 2. Then a line that felt like a soft hammer. April 7th, 1944, questioned again. Margaret says it's not safe. If I do not make it back, she knows. The medal to the boy. One day he will understand what it means. He read the line twice, then a third time, the words changing weight rather than sense. He put the notebook down and looked around the room as though it might answer the question gathering inside him. Why here? Why sealed? Why preserved like a chapel hidden behind a painted wall? He pictured Margaret alone at twilight, with a hammer and a nail set, hands steady, mouth set. He pictured her pausing to listen for a car on the road, a knock at the door, the world coming to take something away. Buddy's paw tapped the floor once. Ethan blinked, looked at the letter again, and this time slid a thumbnail under the edge of the wax. He worried the seal loose with patience until it lifted whole. The paper mouth opened with a dry whisper. Inside, a folded sheet and a smaller scrap. He unfolded the larger. The handwriting began sure, then wavered where ink had pooled and the nib had scraped. Words from a man writing against time. "To my son, if this ever reaches you," he read. The voice in the lines belonged to the man in the photo and to no one else. And it spoke of bridges more than battle, of the calculus of risk where civilians crossed rivers under fire, of a company whose job was to make terrain passable when war's logic wanted it torn. It spoke of being swept under when a charge detonated wrong, and of waking to a kitchen lamp, lit above a face he did not yet know he loved. It spoke Margaret's name with reverence, not claim. It spoke of rumors and patrols and the way law can become rough when it forgets mercy. I thought of taking her with me. One paragraph began, "God knows that is what breath wants, but she is carrying something better than breath. She carries proof that love survives ruins. If I stay, they will find me and make her guilty by my presence. If I go, perhaps their attention will go with me. Tell the boy I left so that he could stay." The line after was blurred, the letters sloped and washed as if written in rain or tears. "I do not go to disappear. I go to clear the way." The sentence ended there. Below it, the faint oval of a fingerprint, smudged gray into the fibers of the page. For a long while, the only sound was the bulb's thin hum and the patient ticking of the hallway clock filtering through the wall. Ethan folded the letter along its old crease and laid it flat upon the blotter. Buddy placed his chin on Ethan's knee and looked up with those amber eyes that made promise without words. Ethan's hand found the familiar place behind the dog's ear. "He didn't vanish," he said, voice low and even, the way he spoke into radios when steadiness mattered. "He chose the hard road so we could keep this house and this name." He returned the letter to its envelope, but did not reseal it. He slid it into the second drawer beneath the pocket Bible, not to hide it, but to put it where a heartbeat belonged, close at hand, not on display. He lifted the photograph of Margaret and Carl again and, after a moment, set it on the desk where the bulb's light fell soft across their faces. The two looked back at him in the hush, like witnesses asking nothing but honesty. On the crate stack, a cloth bundle had been tucked tight into a corner. He loosened the twine. Inside lay small things that carried more weight than they should. A brass button, a service patch, a child's knitted cap, too small for any head he remembered. He turned the cap over and found a tag hand-stitched in blue. HC. He closed his hand around the wool until it warmed. He stood at last and took a long look around the room. The bulb wavered again and steadied, its hum like a sleeping thing. He pulled the cord. The room fell to flashlight and then to dark. He eased the inner door mostly shut to leave a hairline of shadow, enough for air, enough for him to believe the past could breathe. Back in the study, he propped the outer panel and brushed sawdust from his sleeves. Through the window, a pewter light lay across the lake. The mist had thickened into evening. The world outside felt sealed too, he thought, as if it had agreed to keep a secret a little longer. Buddy nosed his hand once, and Ethan nodded as if the dog had asked a question and he'd decided on an answer. He would not rush. He would take this one truth at a time, the way good bridges are made, span by span, with care enough to hold. He turned off the flashlight, set it on the table, and listened to the small, tenacious sounds of the old house. The clock refusing to miss its next tick, the porch settling, the rain returning in a faint curtain against the eaves. For the first time since the funeral, he felt the noise in his head dim to something like a far shore. He rested his palm on the wall where fresh paint met old. "Thank you," he said, not sure whether he spoke to the house, the past, or the woman who had made both bearable, and then he and Buddy stepped out, closing the door with the same care it had taken to open it. Morning light crept softly through the lace curtains, turning the air pale gold. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, where Margaret once shelled peas and hummed to fill the silence. Beside the letter lay the small wool cap he had found in the hidden room, its tag stitched with two fading initials, HC. He turned it over slowly, thumb following the uneven thread. His father's beginning, sealed in yarn and time. Buddy lay stretched across the floorboards, chin on his paws, watching. The kettle whistled, then quieted when Ethan shut it off. The house held its breath again. He unfolded the letter with both hands and began to read where he'd stopped the night before. "To my son, if this ever reaches you." The handwriting was steady at first, each line pressed deep into the paper, as though the writer had been building something meant to last. Karl Reinhardt wrote not as a soldier seeking glory, but as a man trying to make sense of duty. "I was not trained to fight," he began, "but to mend. My work is bridges, not battlefields. We clear mines, we lift wreckage, we lay planks so others may cross. Every crossing has a cost. Sometimes it is only wood, sometimes men." Ethan paused, the words tightening in his chest. The way Karl described it, calm, exact, almost tender, was how men wrote when they had seen too much. He looked toward the window, where mist still hung low over the lake. For a heartbeat, the creak of the rafters made him flinch, a sound too close to the whistle of shells he used to hear in his sleep. Buddy's paw brushed his boot, a quiet reminder that this was home, not the field. He exhaled, steadied his hand, and read on. Carl wrote of the ambush near a nameless river. We were setting charges to slow pursuit. The night turned to fire. I remember falling, then water, then silence. When I woke, I was staring at a lantern's light and the face of a woman who refused to leave me. Her name was Margaret. She said she was only a nurse, but she had more courage than any officer I knew. She hid me in a small cabin by the lake. We spoke little. She mended my shoulder. I fixed her roof. We became two lives woven through one quiet day after another. Love came like breath, so gentle I almost missed it. Ethan could see her now, younger, sleeves rolled up, face lit by the same resolve that had carried her through every hardship. Then the letter darkened. They say a deserter is hiding nearby. Patrols come often. One stopped me by the mill and asked my name. I lied. He didn't believe me. Margaret knows what will happen if they find me here. The ink that followed had bled and run, as if from rain or tears. I have thought of taking her with me. God knows I have. But she carries something greater than my own breath. A child who bears both our names, though the world will only know hers. If I stay, they will find me and hang her beside me. If I go, she may live. So I go, not to flee, but to clear the way. I do not abandon her. I make room for her to survive. The next line trailed off, ending in a long slash of ink, a smear that blurred into the paper grain. Ethan sat back, staring at the words as though they could still warm the air. Buddy raised his head, ears flicking. "He didn't disappear, Buddy," Ethan whispered. "He became the reason we exist." A knock startled them both. Buddy gave one deep bark, then quieted when Ethan opened the door. A woman stood there in a long gray coat, raindrops clinging to her braid. Sarah Blake, the town historian, had that calm, perceptive look that always made people tell her more than they meant to. She was tall and slender, a loose gray-blonde braid resting over one shoulder, eyes the color of faded cornflowers, pale blue, kind, unflinching. "Morning," she said. "I saw your truck. Figured you'd still be here." "Yeah," Ethan said, voice rough. "Couldn't leave yet." Sarah's gaze drifted to the letter on the table. "That the one?" He nodded. "Found it behind a sealed wall. Guess she meant for me to find it." Sarah stepped inside, the scent of rain following her. "I remember your grandmother when I was a girl," she said. "She helped my mother with ration forms. Quiet woman, but strong. People respected her because she didn't gossip, not even when everyone else did." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Yeah, that sounds like her." Sarah hesitated, then added, "There were stories, though, about a stranger by the lake. Some thought he was a deserter, others said a spy. Your grandmother never denied it. She just said not every secret is born from shame." "She was right," Ethan said, folding the letter carefully. "He wasn't a spy, just a man who built bridges when the world was breaking them." Sarah studied his face for a moment and smiled faintly. "You look like her when you talk that way. Same eyes, same quiet fire." She reached into her coat pocket and drew out a thin folder wrapped in twine. "Found this while sorting the town archives. Think it belongs to you." Inside were old photographs. Margaret smiling beside the lake, her hair catching the wind. Another of a small boy holding a toy boat. On the back, in neat handwriting, Henry Cole, 1951. Ethan traced the edge of the photo with a shaking finger. "That's my father." Sarah nodded. "Your grandmother asked for that extra copy the day it was developed. Said every bridge needs both sides." He looked at the image again. The boy's grin, the same tilt of the chin he saw in the mirror each morning. The wool cap on the child's head was unmistakable, the same one now resting beside the letter. "She kept it all this time," he murmured. Sarah's voice softened. "She carried both of them, Carl's silence and Henry's childhood. and never let either break her. Ethan swallowed. She was stronger than we ever knew. Outside, the church bell marked noon, its echo rolling over the lake. Sarah stood, brushing rain from her sleeve. "Whatever you do with that letter," she said, "let it rest somewhere peaceful. She'd have wanted that." Ethan nodded, eyes fixed on the letter and the cap beside it. "I think I understand now." After she left, the silence felt different, not empty, but full of recognition. Ethan carried the photo to the table, set it next to the cap, and watched the past align itself in small, quiet things. Thread, paper, ink, and love. Through the window, the lake caught a shard of sunlight, glimmering against the skeleton of an old wooden bridge half submerged in still water. He reached down to scratch Buddy's neck. "Come on, boy," he whispered. "We've got work to do." Buddy's tail swept once against the floor. Together they stepped out onto the porch, into rain-washed light. And as the wind lifted off the lake, Ethan realized he was no longer standing in his grandmother's shadow. He was walking the path she and Carl had cleared, one bridge at a time. The wind had shifted that evening, carrying the scent of wet cedar and chimney smoke from across the lake. Ethan stood on the porch with his jacket collar turned up, the wool cap marked HC still in his hand. The house behind him glowed faintly through the curtains, warm, quiet, and full of questions. Somewhere inside, the letter from Carl lay folded on the kitchen table, its words echoing through his mind like ripples widening across still water. He couldn't rest. The letter had answered one mystery, but left another. What kind of woman could carry such a truth for 70 years without bitterness or complaint? He had loved his grandmother his whole life, but he realized now that love and understanding weren't always the same thing. To know her, he would have to ask someone who had seen her not as the sainted figure he'd grown up with, but as the woman she had been when the world was still young. That thought brought him down the dirt lane toward the edge of town, where the birches leaned close over the narrow road, and the old Whitlow cottage crouched beneath their branches. The porch light was still on, though it was nearly dusk. Alma Whitlow had been Margaret's neighbor for over half a century. She was 96 now, thin as a reed, her white hair kept in a loose bun that trembled when she spoke. Her skin was soft and pale, but her eyes, pale gray like early frost, still held the sharp, lucid intelligence of someone who never missed a detail. She was the kind of woman who had seen the town rise, burn, and rebuild, and had remained rooted through it all. When Ethan knocked, the door opened before he could even call out. "You look just like her," Alma said, her voice thin but steady. "Come in, child. The kettle's already on." The cottage was small and heavy with the scent of mint and wood smoke. Photographs crowded every surface. Faces from 100 years of living, soldiers in sepia tones, children with wild hair, long-gone husbands standing proudly in uniforms. A black cat named Cinder, half-blind but dignified, sat on a windowsill, tail curled neatly around its paws. Ethan sat in the chair Alma pointed to, feeling like he was stepping into the last warm corner of a fading world. "I found something," he said quietly. "A letter. From Carl Reinhardt." Alma froze halfway to the stove. The teacup in her hand rattled slightly against its saucer. "So, she kept it after all," she murmured. "You knew?" Ethan asked, startled. Her mouth curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Everyone suspected something. Only a few of us knew for sure. Your grandmother told me about him the winter Henry was born. She didn't cry, not once. She just said she owed him her life, and the world would never understand what he'd done for her." Alma set down the cups and settled into her chair opposite him. The lamplight carved fine lines into her face, lines that looked like maps of years gone by. "When Carl disappeared, she was already carrying Henry," she said. The town didn't take kindly to secrets back then. Some called her foolish, others called her worse. But Margaret never raised her voice, never argued. She went to work at the library every morning, helped families send letters to sons they'd lost, stitched uniforms in the evenings. If someone asked who Henry's father was, she just said, "A man who saved lives." And that was the end of it. Ethan listened, hands tightening around the cup. She never told Henry? No, Alma said softly. She wanted him to grow without that shadow. She said a child should never inherit someone else's guilt or someone else's pain. The old woman's gaze turned toward the window, where the birch branches swayed in the dark. I remember her walking to church every Sunday with Henry holding her hand. Some people whispered, others just watched, but she walked tall. She had that quiet dignity that made you feel ashamed for doubting her. Ethan felt something burn behind his eyes. She carried it all alone, he said. Not quite alone, Alma said gently. Faith carried her, and kindness. I think she believed that if she kept doing good, someday the world would forgive what it never understood. For a long while, the only sound was the tick of the clock and Cinder's faint purr from the window. Alma leaned forward. You came back from war, didn't you? Ethan nodded. I did, but some of me stayed there. She studied him with the patient eyes of someone who had watched grief take many shapes. Your grandmother knew what that was like. Maybe not the battlefield kind, but the kind you fight alone, inside your own heart. She lost her husband before she ever got to call him that. Lost her son to a world that never knew the truth, but she never let the bitterness through. That's courage, Ethan. Not the kind they pin medals for, but the kind that keeps people like me alive long enough to tell the story. He swallowed hard. She never said a word about herself, not once. She never needed to, Alma replied. Every time she helped someone, that was her way of speaking. The lamp flickered, and the room went quiet except for the faint hum of the kettle cooling. Ethan reached into his pocket and set the cap on the table. Do you remember this? Alma smiled, the wrinkles at her mouth deepening. Of course, she knitted it while she was pregnant. Said the boy would need something warm for the road ahead, wherever life took him. She brushed the fabric gently with a trembling hand. She gave away everything else but kept this. It was her promise that love was still real, even when everything else was gone. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the lake, slow and distant. Ethan stared at the small cap, and something inside him unclenched. The tremor in his hands, the one that had followed him since Afghanistan, quieted for the first time in years. Alma must have seen it because her eyes softened. She'd be proud of you, she said. You carry their courage in your blood, the kind that survives. When Ethan finally stood to leave, the rain had stopped. Alma walked him to the door, her steps slow but sure. One more thing, she said. The day Henry left for service, your grandmother said something I never forgot. Take kindness with you, she told him, even if the world gives you nothing back. I think she meant that for all of us. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He drove back to the lake house through mist and starlight. The road curved past the old cemetery where the oaks leaned low over the stones. He stopped there, killed the engine, and stepped out. The night was damp and quiet, the air alive with the faint sound of crickets and the far-off hoot of an owl. He found her grave easily, Margaret Cole, 1922-2018. Someone, maybe Sarah, had left a small bouquet of wildflowers by the headstone. Ethan knelt, his knees sinking into the wet grass. Buddy sat beside him, silent, watching. I thought I understood war, Ethan whispered, but I never understood what it takes to survive it. He took the wool cap from his pocket and laid it on the stone, the initials HC facing upward. The moonlight caught the threads, turning them silver. You carried his courage and his silence, he said, voice breaking, and somehow you gave it to all of us. Buddy leaned close, pressing his head against Ethan's shoulder, a soft weight grounding him in the present. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of mint from the lake and something else, warm, familiar, like the memory of a lullaby hummed from another room. Ethan closed his eyes and let it wash over him. The world felt whole again, if only for a moment. The morning came gray and damp, the kind of quiet that felt like reverence. Ethan woke before dawn, unable to shake the echo of Alma's words. The house was still, the air filled with the faint smell of pine and the lingering sweetness of old tea. He moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, each floorboard creak sounding like the whisper of someone keeping him company. Buddy followed close behind, his tail low, his eyes alert but gentle, the way he always was when he sensed Ethan's mind was someplace far away. Ethan had not planned to go back into the hidden room, but something about Alma's story made him feel there was more yet to find. Something Margaret had left for him to understand, not just remember. He carried a lantern this time, instead of a flashlight, its warm glow softening the edges of the dust and cobwebs. When he pulled the false wall open, the air met him like a sigh from another life. The desk stood waiting exactly as he had left it, the letter from Carl safely tucked in its drawer. But when he reached for it, his fingers brushed against something beneath, a hidden latch carved into the wood. He pressed it, and a shallow compartment slid open. Inside lay a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked with age, the initials KR pressed faintly into the corner. He held it in his hands for a long moment before opening it. The first pages were technical, sketches of bridge designs, notes on tension strength, diagrams of wooden trusses. Carl's handwriting was precise, methodical, yet there was something deeply human about it. The kind of order a man builds when the world around him has turned to chaos. But as Ethan turned the pages, the entries began to shift. The ink grew heavier, the lines closer, the tone more personal. April 2nd, 1944. Built a footbridge near the village of Santa Moore. 57 people crossed before dusk, mostly women and children. One old man carried a cage of birds and refused to leave it. I told him it was foolish. He said the birds had lived through worse. Maybe we all have. Ethan smiled faintly through the ache rising in his throat. The next entry carried a darker tone. April 8th. The commanding officer ordered the bridge burned after the refugees passed. Said the enemy might use it, I argued. He said mercy slows victory. I built bridges to save lives, not to trap them. Disobeyed the order. Stayed behind until the river swallowed the supports. I can still hear the birds. The pages that followed were a patchwork of fear and hope, sketches of tunnels under barns, rough maps of safe routes, names of families he had hidden in trucks marked as supply convoys. In one entry, Carl wrote about smuggling children through the woods at night, using lantern light reflected off tin plates as silent signals. Ethan could see it all, the flickering light, the trembling hands, the man leading others through the dark because he couldn't bear to watch them die. If they call me a traitor for saving them, one page read, then I will wear the word like a medal, better to be forgotten for kindness than remembered for cruelty. Ethan closed his eyes. His hand trembled slightly as he turned to the last page. The handwriting there was weaker, the ink uneven, as if written by a man whose strength was slipping away. If you read this, Margaret, it means I did not return. I hope the bridge held through the flood. I hope the child grows strong enough to walk across it someday. Teach him that goodness is not weakness. Tell him to build, even when others destroy. Tell him to live the part of my life I could not finish. Ethan stopped reading. His breath caught in his throat as the words blurred before him. For a long time, He just sat there, the lantern flickering across the pages, his reflection trembling faintly in the glass chimney. The weight of all those years, the war, his own battles, the silence of his grandmother, seemed to settle inside him all at once. Buddy padded over and rested his head gently on Ethan's knee. The dog's fur smelled faintly of rain and pine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him from slipping into the old familiar dark that waited just beyond the edge of thought. Ethan reached down and stroked the shepherd's head. "You'd have liked him," he murmured. "He built things. You'd have followed him anywhere." Outside, dawn finally broke. The light filtered through the cracks in the boards, catching the dust in gold. Ethan turned the pages back once more and noticed something he'd missed, a loose sheet tucked between the last two entries. It was a small piece of paper, folded twice and sealed with a faint thumbprint. He opened it carefully. "To whoever finds this, if kindness survives the war, it will not be because of soldiers or officers. It will be because of the people who refuse to stop helping, even when the world tells them to harden. Do not let mercy die. It is the only bridge worth crossing." The ink had bled at the edges, the signature faded beyond recognition. But Ethan didn't need to see it. He knew the hand that had written those words, the same man whose metal had read, "To save one life is to save the world entire." He placed the notebook gently on the desk, as if it were something alive. His grandmother had read these pages once, maybe twice, and then locked them away, not out of shame, but out of protection. She had kept Carl's legacy safe until her grandson was strong enough to carry it. Ethan looked around the small room again. What once felt haunted now felt hallowed. The shadows no longer hid sorrow. They guarded it. He took the metal from the tin box and laid it on top of the journal. Then he wrote a small note of his own on a scrap of paper he found in the drawer. "Your bridges still stand." He placed it between the pages and closed the cover. When he stepped outside, the morning fog had begun to lift. The lake shone, pale and calm, the old half-submerged bridge stretching out like a promise that had survived its own ruin. Sarah's words came back to him. She'd want it to end somewhere peaceful. Maybe that place wasn't an ending at all. Maybe it was this, the moment when memory became direction. Ethan stood there a long time with Buddy beside him, the wind tugging gently at his coat, the smell of damp earth and cedar heavy in the air. He felt no weight in his chest now, only the steady rhythm of something returning to balance. The lantern's flame wavered once, then steadied. He turned back toward the house, ready at last to begin again. The rain came just before dusk, soft and steady, whispering against the windows like a lullaby that belonged to another lifetime. Ethan sat by the old desk, the journal and letters neatly stacked beside the folded flag that once hung in the hallway. The faint scent of mint still lingered in the air, a fragrance that seemed to follow him now, as if Margaret's presence was stitched into the very breath of the house. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and Buddy lay curled in front of it, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, the quiet sentinel of the only world Ethan had ever truly called home. The decision had come easily. He couldn't let Carl's story vanish again, buried in silence and misunderstanding. With steady hands, Ethan scanned every page of the journal, the letter, the photograph, and the medal. Each item became a piece of the truth that history had ignored. He wrote a brief letter to accompany the files. These records belong to the story of a man who built bridges, not only across rivers but between people. His name deserves to stand among the honorable. He addressed it to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, sealed the envelope, and placed it on the counter beside a small brass key, the one that had once locked the hidden room. It felt like both an ending and a beginning. 2 weeks passed before the reply came. The envelope bore a government seal, and the thin, impersonal type of an official memo. But when Ethan opened it, something human beat beneath the words. Dear Mr. Cole, following your submission, we have reviewed the case of Captain Carl Reinhardt, U.S. Army Engineer, Corps, attached to European Humanitarian Division, 1944. Our findings confirm his role as a non-combat rescue officer operating in civilian aid during the final year of the war. He was listed missing in action near the Loire crossing, later presumed deceased. Records indicate his name was removed from public commendations post-1945 due to political realignment involving dual national status. Upon re-evaluation, his actions qualify under the classification humanitarian heroism. A formal correction will be made to the historical register. Thank you for bringing his legacy to light. Respectfully, Lieutenant Collier David Harris, U.S. Army Historical Review Board. Ethan read it twice. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered the page. He leaned back in his chair and looked up toward the framed photograph of Margaret that hung above the mantel. Her eyes, captured in soft grayscale, seemed to meet his across time. You didn't hide a shame, Buddy, he whispered. You hid a saint. Buddy raised his head, amber eyes gleaming in the firelight. He wagged his tail once, as if he too understood. That night, Ethan lit a candle for both of them, for the grandmother who kept love alive through silence, and the man who gave everything to protect it. The rain outside thickened, turning the lake into a mirror of trembling gold. The old bridge, half sunken in gray with moss, shimmered faintly in the reflection of the candle through the window. It was the same bridge Carl had built in his notes, the same bridge Margaret had lived her life to honor, and now it stood once more, not of wood and steel, but of memory and grace. The next day Sarah came by, her boots dripping from the wet ground. She still wore that gray coat with the turned collar, her blonde braid tucked loosely under a wool cap. There was something luminous about her that morning, as if she too carried a sense of closure. She brought a folded newspaper under her arm. They printed it, she said with a small, proud smile, handing it to him. On the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette, a small article bore the headline, Local Veteran Restores Honor to Wesutu, Officer Once Erased from Record. Below it was a photograph of the journal, the medal, and the old bridge by the lake. Ethan's name was in the article, though briefly mentioned. The story centered instead on Carl Reinhardt, a man history had forgotten, but whose courage had returned through the hands of his grandson. Ethan felt warmth spread through his chest as he read the closing line. Kindness does not end with silence. It waits for someone brave enough to listen. Sarah watched him quietly, then said, You did what she couldn't. He shook his head. She did everything. I just followed her path. Sarah smiled faintly. You know, there's a grant program in town for veterans who want to restore historical landmarks. The old bridge could use some work. Might be time it stood tall again. Ethan looked out toward the lake. The bridge's shadow stretched across the silver water like an unfinished promise. Maybe, he said softly, but not as a memorial, as a crossing. That afternoon, he walked down to the lake's edge with Buddy trotting at his side. The air was cool and damp, the earth soft beneath his boots. He stood at the start of the bridge, where the board still held faint traces of green moss, and placed his hand on the first beam. The wood felt rough, yet alive beneath his touch. He could almost see them, Carl and Margaret, standing together on the other side, watching, smiling. The wind rippled the surface of the water, carrying the faint scent of mint once more. When night came, Ethan stayed in the guest room upstairs, the one that faced the lake. The nightmares didn't come. No screams, no gunfire, no sudden jolts awake. Only the steady rhythm of rain on the roof and the whisper of leaves outside. He dreamed of bridges, of people crossing safely in the moonlight, of children laughing on the far bank, of soldiers laying down their weapons to help rebuild. And somewhere in that dream, his grandmother's voice spoke softly. "See, Ethan, you were never meant to fight forever. You were meant to build." He woke to the sound of gentle rain and the warmth of Buddy's muzzle pressed against his hand. The lantern still burned low on the nightstand, flickering like a heart that refused to go out. Ethan smiled, a quiet, unguarded smile, the kind he hadn't worn in years. "Come on, Buddy," he whispered. "Let's get to work." Outside, the lake shimmered under the first blush of dawn. The bridge waited, silent but unbroken. The rain eased, leaving behind a hush so deep it felt like blessing. And in that stillness, Ethan finally understood. His healing had never been about forgetting the war, but about learning to honor the ones who'd fought their battles quietly, with kindness, with faith, with love that never needed to be spoken aloud. The morning of the ceremony broke with a kind of stillness that only early autumn could bring. Mist low over the lake, the air cool and clear, the smell of pine sharpened by dew. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his navy blue jacket. His reflection looked steadier than he remembered. The lines at the corners of his eyes had softened, no longer carved by sleepless nights, but shaped by quiet purpose. Buddy sat near the door, tail sweeping the floor, head cocked as if to say, "You're ready." The town hall of Willow Creek was never meant for grandeur. Its white wooden walls had faded to cream, and the flag above the entrance had been mended so many times that its seams told their own kind of history. Inside, rows of folding chairs filled the room. Old portraits hung crookedly along the back wall. Faces of mayors, soldiers, and townsfolk who had lived and died within a few square miles of this very spot. Sarah was already there, arranging a vase of wildflowers near the podium. She looked up when Ethan entered, a smile touching her lips. Her gray coat had been replaced by a soft green dress that brushed just above her knees, her hair braided and pinned loosely, strands catching the morning light. There was something both graceful and grounded about her, the kind of quiet resilience shared by people who'd known grief yet chose to keep believing in goodness. "You made it," she said softly. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, voice low but sure. He glanced toward the front where a small table stood draped in white linen. Upon it rested the bronze medal encased in glass, the Humanitarian Heroism Commendation, engraved with Carl Reinhardt's name. Beside it lay a framed photograph. Carl in uniform, his face serious but kind, and next to it, one of Margaret holding a baby wrapped in a wool blanket. The cap marked HC lay folded neatly between them. A military honor guard lined the side of the stage. Major Paul Whitmore, a tall man in his early 50s with close-cropped silver hair and a weathered but kind face, oversaw the preparations. He had a quiet authority about him, the kind born not from power, but from years of service and loss. When he greeted Ethan, his handshake was firm, his eyes full of respect. "You did something rare," he said. "You gave history its voice back." Ethan nodded. "I just followed what they left behind." As the seats filled, the sound of murmured conversation rose like gentle waves. Veterans in pressed uniforms, townsfolk with gray hair and proud smiles, children clutching small flags. It seemed the whole town had come. When the church bell struck 10, the murmurs faded. Major Whitmore stepped to the podium. His voice carried the calm weight of ceremony. "Today, we gather to honor not just a man, but a legacy. Captain Carl Reinhardt, once lost to war and politics, is remembered now for what he truly was: a builder, a rescuer, a man of mercy. His courage, lived quietly for decades through the people he saved and through one woman who kept his promise alive. He gestured for Ethan to step forward. The sound of Ethan's boots on the wood floor echoed through the hall. He took his place behind the microphone, his fingers gripping the edges of the podium for balance. Buddy sat obediently near the front row, a small ribbon around his collar bearing the words, "For those who kept the faith." Ethan looked out at the faces before him. He saw Alma Whitlow seated in the second row, wrapped in a shawl, her pale eyes glinting with tears. Sarah stood near the side, hands clasped together. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought of the bridge, the way it had shimmered in the rain the morning he made his promise. He took a slow breath. "There are heroes who die on battlefields," he began, his voice trembling. "And there are others who spend their whole lives keeping their promises. My grandmother was one of those people." A hush settled over the room. She never raised her voice, never sought recognition. While the world moved on, she carried someone else's story, a story she protected not because it was hers to tell, but because it was too sacred to lose. Carl Reinhardt built bridges in a war that destroyed them. My grandmother built one in silence, between the past and the future, between pain and forgiveness. He paused, blinking back the sting in his eyes. Buddy shifted and gave a low whine, as if to remind him he wasn't alone. "When I came back from the war, I thought I knew what survival meant," Ethan continued. "But she taught me something different. That surviving isn't just about staying alive. It's about keeping kindness alive, even when the world forgets how to. She did that. For 70 years, she did that." The hall was utterly still. A single cough broke the silence, then quiet again. Ethan smiled faintly. "Today isn't just for Carl, it's for her, and for everyone who ever carried someone else's burden without complaint. I stand here because she believed I could, because she taught me that some bridges are worth rebuilding, no matter how long they've been broken." His voice faltered near the end, but he didn't fight it. Instead, he let the tremor become part of the truth. "I used to think my scars were what made me strong," he said, his eyes glistening. "But now I know. It's love, quiet, patient, stubborn love. The kind my grandmother lived, and the kind that built this town, the kind that never needed to shout to be heard." He stepped back, and the applause came. Not the polite kind, but a standing wave that filled the hall like a storm breaking. Alma rose slowly, clapping with both trembling hands. Sarah wiped her eyes. Even Major Whitmore stood at attention, saluting the photograph on the table. Buddy barked once, sharp and proud, his tail wagging. The crowd laughed softly through their tears. After the ceremony, people lingered. Veterans came to shake Ethan's hand. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves to ask about the man who built the bridge. And Alma whispered to him, "You did her proud, boy. She'd be smiling right now." Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, spilling light over the lake. The town gathered near the water, where a new plaque stood beside the restored bridge. In memory of Captain Carl Reinhardt and Margaret Cole, two lives bound by mercy, whose kindness built more than bridges. Ethan stood beside Sarah as the wind rustled the tall grass. The water shimmered gold, the bridge gleaming like an answered prayer. Sarah leaned close and said quietly, "She wasn't just your grandmother, Ethan. She was the mother of 2 generations." He nodded, eyes on the lake. "Yeah," he murmured. "And somehow, she raised us both." Buddy sat between them, gazing at the bridge, ears perked, as if guarding it from time itself. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel the pull of the past. The silence that once haunted him now felt like home, a silence filled with gratitude, with peace, with love that had outlasted war. As the church bells rang across Willow Creek, Ethan whispered to the wind, "Rest easy, Grandma. The promise is kept." It had been a year since the ceremony, though the days seemed to fold into one another so gently that time itself felt softened. The lake no longer held the heaviness of memory. Its surface reflected the steady rhythm of renewal. Autumn had turned to spring again, and Willow Creek was awake with birdsong and the faint perfume of pine and thawing earth. Ethan stood in the doorway of the house, sleeves rolled up, the scent of sawdust mixing with sunlight. The hidden room, the one that had once held secrets and silence, was now open wide to the air. Dust no longer clung to the rafters, and the boards had been sanded until they glowed with honeyed warmth. Where there had been a sealed wall, there was now a large window facing the lake. Light spilled through it every morning, like forgiveness made visible. He had spent weeks restoring it with his own hands, patching, painting, and polishing each corner as though he were mending something within himself. The shelves that once hid Carl's letter now held books about resilience, grief, and faith. On the main wall, Ethan had hung 3 framed photographs: Margaret standing by the lake in her nurse's uniform, Carl in his bridge-building gear, and Henry, his father, holding a small boy in his arms. Below them rested Carl's medal, the leather-bound journal, and a simple wooden plaque carved by Ethan himself. The words were ones his grandmother used to whisper when the nights were hardest. "Be kind when the world forgets how." He traced each letter with his thumb, feeling the grain of the wood under his skin. It wasn't just a memory now. It was a mission. The townspeople had begun to call it the Haven Room. Sarah had suggested the name, her blue-gray eyes soft as she watched Ethan polish the last frame. "Because that's what it's become," she'd said. "A haven, for those who need reminding that the light's still there." Now, every Thursday afternoon, veterans and townsfolk came by for coffee, quiet conversation, or just a place to sit. The walls no longer echoed with loss, but with laughter and the clinking of mugs. There was Tom Riker, a retired Navy mechanic with a limp and a love for telling stories about engines that had more heart than half the men who built them. Martha Kane, a widowed teacher with curly silver hair and hands always clasped around a cup of tea, read poems aloud to anyone who would listen. Even Alma Whitlow came on warm days, wrapped in her shawl, nodding approvingly at the young people who had begun volunteering there. And then there was Sarah Blake, who seemed to live between the sunlight and the shadows of the place. She helped catalog letters from visiting veterans, organized food drives, and painted a mural on the far wall, an image of a wooden bridge arcing over blue water, with wildflowers growing along its path. She'd grown stronger since the day they'd met. Her laughter carried a quiet confidence, her steps steady. Sometimes, Ethan would find her humming softly while arranging flowers by the window, and for a moment, the room would feel utterly whole. One morning, Ethan sat at the small desk by the window, writing a letter of thanks to those who had donated supplies to the project. Buddy lay at his feet, now a little older, his muzzle flecked with gray but his eyes still bright. He had become something of a local legend, the dog who helped start the Haven Room, the dog who never left his veteran's side. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, painting the lake in pale gold. The reflection shimmered across the ceiling, touching the photographs like a benediction. Ethan paused mid-sentence, pen hovering above the page. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a faint chime, light and clear. He looked up. The old wind chime by the window, the one that had belonged to Margaret, was swaying gently, though the air was perfectly still. Its glass pieces caught the light, scattering it across the walls like fragments of morning. Buddy's ears perked up, his gaze following the movement. Ethan smiled, his chest tightening with a kind of ache that was no longer sorrow, but gratitude. "We kept your promise, Grandma," he said softly. "You can rest now." The wind chime gave one last, delicate note, as if answering. He leaned back in his chair, letting the light fall across his face. Outside, a pair of mallards skimmed across the water, leaving ripples that shimmered toward the far bank. He thought of Carl's journal, the sketches of bridges, the maps of safe routes, and realized this was one more bridge, invisible but enduring, the link between their courage and his peace. The bell above the door jingled as someone stepped inside. Sarah, carrying a basket of muffins, smiled. "You're here early." "Couldn't sleep," Ethan said, his voice quiet but easy. "The light woke me." She set the basket down and looked around the room. "It's beautiful," she said. "You know, if she could see this, I think she'd say you finally learned how to stop fighting." He chuckled. "Maybe she's been teaching me that all along." Sarah brushed a speck of flour from her sleeve. "You should frame that saying somewhere bigger," she said, nodding toward the plaque. "People ask about it every time they come." Ethan smiled. "They don't need to read it to feel it. It's what this place is made of." Outside, the morning deepened. Veterans began arriving one by one, greeting each other with handshakes and quiet laughter. Buddy trotted to the door, wagging his tail, welcoming each visitor like an old friend. Ethan watched them gather around the long table, men and women once strangers, now bound by shared silence and understanding. Sarah handed out mugs of coffee. Alma sat in her usual chair near the window, humming softly. For a moment, Ethan just stood back and looked at them. It wasn't a ceremony or a monument or anything grand. It was something smaller, humbler, but real. It was healing. As the morning went on, the light shifted higher, streaming through the window and catching the faces of those gathered inside. It landed on the framed photo of Margaret and Carl, making the glass glow like stained crystal. Ethan felt a hand slip into his, Sarah's, warm and steady. "Looks like they finally came home," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes on the lake. All of them did. Buddy settled beside his chair, letting out a soft sigh. His gaze drifted toward the water, where sunlight shimmered over the ripples. Ethan reached down, resting his hand gently on the dog's back. "We found peace, Buddy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The kind she always wanted us to have." The wind stirred again, lifting the chime by the window. Its sound mingled with the laughter inside, the creak of floorboards, the low hum of life returning. And for the first time, the silence in the house by Willow Creek wasn't empty. It was alive, with memory, with mercy, with light that would never fade. Time passed softly over Willow Creek, the way sunlight moves through water, quiet, patient, unstoppable. The Haven Room became more than a place. It became a pulse in the heart of the town. Veterans found solace there, widows found companionship, strangers became family. People brought stories, laughter, and tears, and in return, they left lighter. Ethan often watched from the porch as Buddy rested beside him, the lake rippling with sunset. The bridge shimmered in gold, and he understood something he never had before. The miracle wasn't in the letter, or the medal, or even the restored honor. It was in the love that outlasted silence, the kindness that survived fear, the faith that endured time. What Margaret built wasn't just a home, it was a sanctuary for the weary. What Carl left behind wasn't just courage, it was proof that goodness never dies. It simply waits to be remembered. And Ethan, he became the bridge they once dreamed of, not made of wood or steel, but of compassion strong enough to hold the weight of broken hearts. Sometimes miracles don't come from heaven with thunder or wings. They rise quietly in human hands that refuse to stop giving. In a smile shared with a stranger, in a prayer whispered for someone you'll never meet, in the choice to be kind even when no one's watching. If this story touched your heart, Take a moment tonight to share it with someone who needs light. Leave a prayer in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to keep these stories of faith, love, and second chances alive. May God bless you and your loved ones. May His peace fill your home like morning light over still waters. And may you always find the courage to build bridges wherever the world has forgotten how.